Who was Stepan Bandera, and what did he believe in? Bandera today is a controversial figure by and large approved of within Ukraine as an important national historical figure, while the facts behind his life have generally been obfuscated outside of Ukraine by deception and pseudo-historical propaganda which originated from within nations in history such as the Soviet Union and Poland. In life, Stepan Bandera was the leader of his own faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, known as the OUN-B, or Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists Bandera, which sought Ukrainian independence, opposing both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, hoping to achieve a self-reliant Ukraine free from foreign domination, especially from the USSR, which he viewed as the greatest enemy of the Ukrainian people. Stepan Bandera is often portrayed by Russian and pro-Russian outlets as a conniving anti-Semitic collaborator. This, however, is simply a lie. In fact, Bandera's faction of the OUN, the OUN-B, didn't see it fit to coordinate an alliance with the Nazis, and for the entire duration of the OUN-B's existence, it resisted collaboration with Nazi Germany. Rather, Bandera hoped to defend Ukraine from the USSR through self-reliance alone, and when Nazi Germany heard in 1941 that Bandera had declared Ukrainian independence, the Nazis arrested him and demanded that he revoke the declaration of Ukrainian independence, something which he refused to do, and for this act of defiance against the Nazis, Bandera was sent to a concentration camp, and the Nazis demanded the liquidation of all functionaries of his movement. Near the end of the war, before the Third Reich collapsed, Bandera, while confined to a concentration camp and facing the possibility of execution, was even offered a position at the pro-Nazi Ukrainian Committee, which he rejected without hesitation. His two brothers, Alexander and Vasil Bandera, would be killed by Polish capo guards in Auschwitz in 1942. Were there pro-Nazi Ukrainian nationalists? Yes. Did they initiate pogroms against the Jewish people? Yes. Was Stepan Bandera involved with them? No. Not only do we have no preserved archives of Bandera's response to hearing of Jewish pogroms in western Ukraine, as such responses have quite unfortunately not been preserved, but after his arrest at the hands of the Nazis, it's hard to believe that Bandera would have had much of a stake in these matters regardless, and as documents I will defer to later show, it is impossible to seriously believe that Bandera would have approved of them. To the extent that the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists did collaborate with the Germans, the question must be posed: what was Ukraine to do upon the threat of Soviet imperialism in the East and Nazi imperialism in the West, neither of which granted support to Ukrainian independence, but only one of which had ever committed a genocide against the Ukrainian people in the preceding years? The fact is that the USSR was the OUN's most important enemy, and when push came to shove, the OUN really had no choice but to align themselves with Germany against the grip of the USSR as a form of resistance. Within the OUN-B's UPA, or Ukrainian Insurgent Army, there existed many openly Jewish members who experienced no discrimination within the organization, making the demonstration of Bandera's supposed pro-Nazism very difficult for Soviet propagandists. A few good examples lie in Lazar Abramovich Orekhovstein, Moses Abramovich Orekhovstein, or Dobrovsky Leba Itzik Yosefovich. To add on to this, within the OUN-B specifically, the ethnic and religious Jew Hasman Mandik Gisi stands out as a prime fighter in their ranks, and it cannot be said that the rescuing of the 7-year-old Jewish girl, Irina Reichenberg, from Gestapo persecution by the acting head of the OUN and commander-in-chief of the UPA, Roman Shukevich, stands out at all as a particularly anti-Semitic act. Many defer to the OUN's resolution of the Second Great Assembly of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists as a conclusive, documentary piece of evidence to finally confirm Bandera's supposed Nazistic beliefs. The document states, quote, "The Jews in the USSR are the most loyal support of the ruling Bolshevik regime and the vanguard of Moscow imperialism in Ukraine." Although it is important to concede that this statement is indeed anti-Semitic, it is also equally important to acknowledge that the document is not referring to Jews as a whole worldwide, but rather only those Jews within the USSR. Clearly, this document isn't referring to the Jews of Gallica, who Bandera grew up with during a period of great solidarity between ethnic Ukrainians and Ukrainian Jews. Regardless, what the document goes on to state, in the succeeding sentence, which is inarguably much more important, is that, quote, "the anti-Jewish sentiments of the Ukrainian masses are being exploited by the Muscovite Bolshevik government in order to divert their attention from the real cause of the disaster and to direct them to pogroms against the Jews at this time of disruption." The document here, although grossly overgeneralizing Jews of the USSR, explicitly clarified that promoting violence against the Jewish people was in fact nothing more than scapegoating, referring to the promotion of violence against the Jews as simply a method of distraction. As although in Bandera and the OUN-B's view, Russian Jews did indeed broadly support the USSR, the true fight of the OUN wasn't an ethnic battle against Jews or against Judaism. The only political battle which would be waged against groups for the OUN was under the condition that such groups supported the Soviet state. Again, to be sure, these statements are in bad taste, but they're standard for the time and don't call for action against the Jewish people, and the document even goes so far as to denounce anti-Semitic actions taken against the Jews. Elsewhere, in the aforementioned resolution document, regardless of the three sentences which ring of a very mild anti-Semitism, which, by the way, isn't at all unheard of among left-wing revolutionary activists in history, such as Bakunin, Karl Marx, or Proudhon, all of whom were disgustingly anti-Semitic. The rest of this resolution document goes on to advocate for the abolition of economic exploitation, labor rights, free healthcare and education, collective management of labor through labor unions, etc. By September of 1941 in Ukraine, the German Task Force C reported to Berlin that, quote, almost nowhere was the population involved in actions against the Jews, and in October of that year, that, quote, there is no anti-Semitism of a racist and ideological nature among the population, as well as, quote, for repressions against Jews, the Ukrainian population lacks both leaders and spiritual fervor. And finally, early in the next year, and most displeasingly to the Nazi task force, they reported that, quote, today it is clearly established that the Bandera movement provides false passports not only to all its members, but also to Jews. The popularly referenced directive from localized supposed OUN leaders, which stated that, quote, at a time of chaos and confusion, it is permissible to liquidate undesirable Polish, Russian, and Jewish activists, especially supporters, not only was a completely unauthorized statement from local cell leaders, not national leaders, but more likely than not would find its origins in NKVD subversion, as over the course of the fight between Soviet forces and the Ukrainian nationalists, Soviet NKVD agents would frequently disguise themselves as Ukrainian nationalists and commit horrid atrocities and state horrendous things in order to subvert nationalist forces. A very important example of this is in flyers which contained the statement, quote, Moscow, the Hungarians, the Jews, these are your enemies, destroy them. These statements were not, in fact, statements from OUN leaders at all either, but rather local level unapproved statements. This would be akin to if a local Boy Scout troop began releasing anti-Semitic propaganda or even committing pogroms. Does this really say anything about the national organization? No. Does it say things about the beliefs of the individuals who comprise very localized units? Yes, without a doubt, and nobody's here to deny that Ukraine didn't contain rampant anti-Semitism throughout the 20th century, as the OUN-B resolution quoted from earlier was very sharp to point out. The real leaders of the OUN were quick to respond to these anti-Semitic and xenophobic occurrences with denunciations of their own, as can be shown in the following quote from Colonel Josip Poziceniuk, State Secretary of Information and head of the UPA Political Bureau. Quote, what befits the hot-tempered insurgent chieftains who, apart from xenophobia and anti-Semitism, had nothing else to do? For us, the enemy shouldn't be defined by race, but by the degree of hostility to our idea and the activity of his rank against us. There should be no anti-Semitism and any phobia in the program. The program must recognize the rights of minorities and even emphasize benefits for those who will cooperate and offer sacrifice in the struggle for the Ukrainian state. The following paper displayed on screen is an OUN-UPA anti-Nazi and anti-Soviet propaganda piece titled No to Hitler, No to Stalin. Many forget that the UPA, the Ukrainian insurgent army previously mentioned, was conceived as a direct military response to Nazi German occupation. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22nd of 1941, Ukrainian lands were plunged into a new kind of oppression. The radical wing of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, the OUN-B, in the wake of this invasion, led by Stepan Bandera, declared Ukrainian independence in Lviv on June 30th of 1941, a bold move which demonstrated that Ukrainians intended to fight for their self-determination. However, of course, the Nazis quickly suppressed the declaration and arrested Bandera in July of 1941. This event catalyzed the reorganization of nationalist forces, and by the summer of 1942, figures such as Roman Shukevich emerged as military leaders who were recognizing that armed resistance was the only viable path to safeguard Ukrainian independence. In response, the nationalist movement consolidated its fighters into what would become known as the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which formally mobilized as a guerrilla force around October of 1942. They committed sabotage against German logistics and military installations, ambushing them in the Carpathian region during the summer and autumn months of 1942, and multiple accounts from the time provide detailed recollections of the period, which linked the Declaration of Independence on June 30th of 1941, the subsequent arrests in July, and the reformation of partisan forces by October of 1942 as the most important junctures in the birth of the UPA. From its inception, the UPA attacked and antagonized German occupation forces, with UPA unit Halida attacking German forces in Lviv villages, capturing German troops to exchange for Ukrainian civilians. In Korchin, in summer of 1943, UPA units attacked a Nazi logistics operation, stealing weapons and supplies. One notable event was on March 23rd of 1944, in which UPA partisans in the Kalush district killed 40 German collaborationists in an ambush, destroying their equipment as well. 3 days later, in Mizun, UPA forces ambushed a Hungarian battalion allied with the Germans, inflicting heavy casualties and seizing weapons. The UPA was notoriously not anti-Semitic. Many Jews participated openly in the Ukrainian insurgent army. One notable example is that of a Jewish doctor from Dorobich, known by the codename Kulm, or Godfather, who volunteered for the UPA in 1943 after his family was executed by German forces in 1941. In early 1944, during a training course for UPA soldiers held near Skol, Godfather served in a training unit led by Schit, where he taught first aid and epidemic prevention. On October 14th of 1944, during an encirclement of the Oleni school by a large Bolshevik detachment, despite heavy losses, Godfather continued ensuring that insurgents received vital medical support. Throughout 1945 to 1946, Godfather managed an underground hospital in the Carpathians, traversing hundreds of kilometers through the mountains of Stanislaviv and Dorobich. In the winter of 1946, when Soviet forces surrounded his underground hospital, Godfather organized the evacuation of wounded UPA insurgents, and faced with imminent capture by encircling Soviet forces, Godfather chose to fight rather than surrender, allowing himself to be shot by Soviet forces while defending his fellow countrymen. Godfather was posthumously awarded the Silver Cross of Merit by the Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council. Many other Ukrainian Jews, such as Samuel Newman, Anton Coleman, and Varm Shai, were vital in the Ukrainian insurgent army as well. Perhaps the most striking example is that of the Polish Jew, which I briefly mentioned in passing before, Hasman Mandik-Dzisi, a Ukrainian military leader and soldier of the UPA who gave the infamous quote before his death, "You will win the Ukrainian state or you will die in the struggle for it." Official OUN-B publications, such as one entitled Development of the Nation, laid the ideological groundwork for a multi-ethnic Ukrainian state that would include Jews as equal partners. In 1944, during the international discussions led by Josip Pozykchaniuk, a central ideologist of the Ukrainian Liberation Movement and the State Secretary of Information under the Free Ukrainian State, Josip stressed the fact that the national program must be forbidden from containing any antisemitism, and that it should protect the rights of all national minorities of Ukraine. Similarly, in a 1947 programmatic work by former Secretary of the Ministry of Information of Ukraine's national government of 1941, Yaroslav Staruk, national intolerance was officially to be condemned by the Ukrainian state. Bogdan Kazanovsky, an active OUN member, recalled that Deputy Commissar of the OUN, Ivan Klimov, known as Legend, had instructed that not a single member of the OUN should participate in any anti-Jewish activities. Klimov stressed the fact that many vital specialists, including foremen and doctors working for the Ukrainian Liberation Movement, were Jewish, and that they were just as much of a part of the OUN as anybody else was. Moreover, Jewish political prisoners, such as Gersh Keller, a former UPA soldier, later would cooperate with Ukrainian dissidents, notably during the large-scale uprising at the Kengir camp in 1954. Furthermore, in 1950, after the war, the OUN released a pamphlet signed by Stepan Bandera himself titled Jews, Citizens of Ukraine, which concluded with, quote, "Long live the State of Israel and friendship between the Jewish and Ukrainian peoples," a statement which should fly in the face of any and all claims of Bandera's supposed anti-Semitism. The reality that few people know about outside of Ukraine is the fact that the KGB narrative constructed to link Bandera to Nazi collaborators such as Theodor Oberlander was simply an informational and psychological special operation. From his youngest years, Bandera was immersed in a multicultural environment, attending a gymnasium in Stry, where Jewish children studied in Ukrainian. His involvement in PLAST, a Ukrainian scouting organization, is especially telling, as the organization was not only centered around fostering national unity, but also in engaging in cooperative activities with other Jewish scouting groups, such as friendly sports matches and joint cultural events. Osip Baziuk, a fellow villager of Bandera, provided a personal testament to his respectable character in 1964, where he recalled Bandera's deep respect and admiration for the people of Uriniv and this other Ukrainian town that I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the name of. Notably, he recalled an incident involving an elderly Jewish man, Aaron Ader, who, despite his own respected status, would arise, remove his yarmulke, and be the first to greet Bandera warmly, clearly showing that Bandera wasn't met with disdain or fear by local Jewish Ukrainian citizens, but with mutual respect and cordiality. During the Warsaw trials against Bandera and his associates, Jewish citizens of Ukraine, such as Leon Berenson, openly defended Bandera. Well, what then did Bandera believe in? We can defer again to the resolution of the Second Grand Council of the OUN-B finalized in 1941. Stepan Bandera believed that all peoples deserved the right to independence, who were suppressed by state violence, advocating for the right to armed struggle as a means of securing their own national liberation. The principle underlined everything that he believed in, including his approach to Ukrainian nationalism, which from day one had been resistant to the foreign occupation regime of Moscow. Rejecting both free market capitalism and Muscovite communism, Stepan Bandera's OUN-B proposed a corporativist system based upon productive solidarity between Ukrainian workers. In Bandera's vision, the economy was to be organized around a collection of professional and occupational labor organizations, which would collectively manage labor relations and economic production. With the division of society organized along the lines of professional organizations, class divisions would be muted and overridden. The state was to be in charge of all of Ukraine's important industries, bringing them under common ownership of the people, especially in fields such as heavy industry, major infrastructure, and transportation networks. Private property rights were to be limited to a social use function and only exclusively allowed in the case of small enterprise and landholdings, provided that they aligned with the national interest of the Ukrainian people. Cooperative and self-management systems, according to the OUN's own 1941 resolution, were to be the primary mechanisms of ownership promoted by the state, where workers would control the means of production at the level of the shop or factory floor. Within private and public enterprises, employees would be mandated to have stakes in management and profit sharing. To Bandera, the collectivized agricultural model of the USSR was a method of slavery and serfdom, not something to be replicated in any way within an independent Ukraine. In line with this idea, he stated, quote, "When the people choose bread between bread and freedom, they eventually lose everything, including bread. If the people choose freedom, they will have bread grown by themselves and not taken away by anyone." The Soviet Union's collectivized farming system was to be abolished and replaced by peasant-run agricultural enterprises as soon as Ukraine achieved its freedom. As the OUN stated, quote, "Ukrainian land to Ukrainian peasants, factories and plants to Ukrainian workers." Legal limits on profits were to be introduced for capitalists, while speculation would be eliminated from the Ukrainian economy. While Bandera was a deeply devout Christian and believed that the maintenance of Christianity in Ukraine was important for the national liberation movement, he firmly believed in the freedom of religion, arguing that as long as the principles of religious doctrine did not antagonize or attempt to subvert the Ukrainian state, that citizens should be allowed to believe in whatsoever they pleased. Regarding the position of national minorities within the Ukrainian state, even including those who spoke Russian in the eastern regions of Ukraine, Bandera believed that all of them had the right to equal standing within society alongside ethnic Ukrainians, and that it would be anti-national, in fact, to attempt to divide the different ethnicities within Ukraine. On the international front, Bandera's primary objective was simply to see the liberation of Eastern Europe and Central Asia from the clutches of the Muscovite regime, which he saw in the Soviet Union as a continuation of Russian imperialism, which had been going on for centuries. As Bandera stated, quote, "It is important for our liberation policy that the Ukrainian liberation revolution be fully evaluated as a continuation of Ukraine's historical struggle against Moscow imperialism, and then of any kind, not only the Bolshevik." This struggle will not cease until the full realization of our goal, which is the complete rupture between Ukraine and Moscow, the reconstruction of the independent, unified Ukrainian state, the collapse of the USSR, and the construction of independent national states in sub-Soviet Europe and Asia, the complete defeat of Russian imperialism, and the creation of a system of states around Russia, closed within its own borders so that it can no longer act with imperialist aggression. As demonstrated through this quotation, it is clear that to Bandera, aiding the rest of the nations in the Soviet Union to be liberated from Muscovite imperialism was the highest international imperative for the OUN. Within his book, Prospects for a Ukrainian Revolution, Bandera anticipated the return of Russia to Ukraine 64 years before the 2014 Russian invasion, all the way back in 1950, stating, quote, "If tomorrow Bolshevism is replaced by another form of Russian imperialism, then it will also turn with all its forces against the independence of Ukraine and its enslavement. The Russian people, as before, will carry that imperialism, will do everything to keep Ukraine in enslavement." He further stated in his 1950 work titled The Third World War and the Liberation Struggle that even if a revolution did spread across Russia, which caused the collapse of the Bolshevik regime, that, quote, "Moscow imperialism will raise its head anew, maybe in several different forms, probably in the anti-Bolshevik revolution, and will turn with all its forces against the liberation revolutions of other people, primarily against Ukraine." He continues, "There is only one Russia, imperialist, and it will continue to be so until Russian imperialism is completely crushed and the Russian people are cured of it through the knowledge that their imperialism brings them the greatest misfortune, sacrifices, suffering, and decline." It's unfortunate that in the same 1950 work, Bandera pointedly described a predicament plaguing Western liberal democracies of the time, which much of the West, particularly American citizens, haven't yet broken out of to this day. What he pointed out was that, quote, "Western nations lack a true understanding and accurate assessment of the real situation in the territories controlled by Moscow. In the West, they see only Russia. Some are entirely unaware, or know very little, that Russia has militarily subjugated and forcefully rules over many nations that have not reconciled and will never reconcile with this enslavement. Others, while aware of the multinational composition of today's USSR, still primarily regard the Russian people as the only significant political force. The nations enslaved by Russia are mostly seen in the West not as fully fledged, self-aware nations striving for their independent existence, but merely as ethnic tribes that are passive objects in Moscow's hands. This makes sense, after all, as again stated by Bandera within a 1951 work titled Against the Ideological Disarmament of the Liberation Fight, quote, "The aversion among Western nations to the revolutionary struggles of other peoples stems from the fact that they are well-fed and content. They would prefer that there be no major changes in the world that could disrupt the existing international order. For them, things are fine as they are, and they do not want to acknowledge that other nations are in an unbearable situation fighting for their rights and for a free life, or that new nations previously pushed under the ice are now emerging onto the world stage." In line with this reality, 2 years prior, in a 1948 pamphlet titled A Word to Ukrainian Nationalist Revolutionaries Abroad, Bandera pointed out that appeasement with the Russian state is futile. As he pointedly states, quote, "Russia, with its deeply ingrained and in the modern era most inflamed expansionist imperialism, will, in every situation and under any circumstances, with all its might and ferocity, lunge at Ukraine to keep it within its empire or to re-enslave it. Both the liberation and the defense of Ukraine's independence must fundamentally rely only on Ukrainian forces, on our own struggle, and on constant readiness for self-defense." But was Bandera not, some may ask, a tyrannical despot in the making? Let Bandera speak for himself. In Prospects of the Ukrainian Revolution, Bandera states, "The monoparty totalitarian system is harmful to the development of the nation, always detrimental to the dominant political monoparty and its ideas. For the whole nation, as well as for every healthy political movement, the most favorable order is one in which true freedom reigns, in which ideals, political programs, and conceptions freely develop and compete with each other, and in which political organizations freely nurture, disseminate, and carry on their activities. In the system of true freedom, the rivalry between different ideological, socio-political currents and organizations is resolved by the criteria of ideological and moral order, and not by coercion and violence. We are fighting for such a system of true freedom, and we will implement it. A tree is known by its fruits, and the factors of political life are recognized by its deeds." So, what are the facts behind Stepan Bandera? Bandera was a staunch Ukrainian revolutionary nationalist, one who dedicated his life to securing Ukraine's independence from Russian imperialism. As the leader of Ukraine's OUN-B, he championed armed struggle for the liberation of his people, envisioning the future of a self-reliant Ukraine built on national solidarity, worker self-management, a heavily nationalized economy, the freedom of small-scale private property, and an economic model of occupational representation that rejected both Soviet communism and free market capitalism. His principles find their origins not in reactionary thought, National Socialist ideology, or any other backwards heinous notions, but in opposition to Russian imperialism in all of its forms, whether Tsarist, Soviet, or in any other ideals that it may pop up within. He foresaw Russia's continued attempts to subjugate Ukraine, accurately predicting the resurgence of Russian expansionism, and insisted upon the fact that Ukraine's struggle wasn't simply about national sovereignty, but about fighting Russian imperialism wherever it took root. Despite Soviet and Russian propaganda intended to tarnish his legacy, Bandera remains an important symbol of survival and resistance for the plurality of Ukrainians, with his ideology continuously reinforcing and inspiring Ukraine and Ukrainian nationalism in its contemporary time of crisis. Whether you view Bandera as a hero or a deranged extremist, that's up to you. But the fact is that his impact on Ukrainian history and the liberation of the Ukrainian people is undeniable.